Ladies and gents, this is Fallen of World War II by the channel Neil Halloran. I think I reacted to this video way long before, but I don't remember it. I did lots of videos, so I don't know. Maybe a year ago I did react to this, but I don't know. So, an animated data-driven documentary about war and peace. The Fallen of World War II looks at the human cost of the Second World War and size up the numbers to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. I'm pretty sure it's gonna be the highest deaths, more than World War I too. Because World War II was just horrible. I mean, obviously that's the case with most wars, but World War II is just ridiculous. Because first of all, in World War I, industrialized weapons were introduced. In World War II, they mastered it basically. So World War II was really horrible with all the weapons, tanks. So if you follow the trend, World War I was introduced with the industrialized weapon, it was horrible, gas attacks and things like that. World War II, where they mastered it, and it was ridiculously horrible. World War III, where we master atomic bombs, let's just say there's not going to be world left. So World War II's deaths are going to be ridiculously high because it was, led by an ideological driven moron who just thought that certain people should be, top of the world, other people should die and things like that. So that guy Hitler basically killed a lot of Jews. Obviously lots and lots of Russians died in that war. Basically in Russian population, women outnumber men because of that reason, because so many died in World War II. Russians basically die a lot in lots of war. I've noticed that. It's just ridiculous. Humans' lives just get lost like that. Other countries obviously lost a lot of people too. But I'm pretty sure Russian number is really, really high. Let's watch the video.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years, and an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers.
There is a channel, Memoirs of World War II, that I react to sometime. They feature these people who are about in around 90s, who were part of the World War II. They are obviously dying at a faster rate since they are in 90s. So there will be a time where basically nobody's alive anymore who experienced this battle. So yeah, check out that channel. It's just really fascinating.
Rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people whose lives are cut short by the war, and see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately. Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23. In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries, and anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths.
When people know that World War II, World War I, lots of people died, they need to understand that these are not just some people died. These are the people who are young in their 20s, late teens in 20s, rarely in 30s. I mean, obviously there are all ages died, but most people who were in the front lines were young people. That's just effed up, man. Their life began, they basically were in development stage their whole life. They become adult, their life is basically starting now, and they went to the war and died. That's really sad, man.
And we'll begin with American soldiers. Over 400,000 died.
Damn, Americans joined late and 400,000 of them died. Imagine how many others who've been from the war from the start would have died. It definitely is going to be a multi-million number.
Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the US wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor, 2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell.
Also, this gives me that thought that everybody nowadays, goes, why Americans always, go inside in anybody's conflicts? Why Americans are always there, even though they don't have to? Example is World War I, World War II. In World War I, they're like, I'm not gonna be involved. Few ships of theirs sank. All right, chill out. And then more thing happened, and in the end, they declared war. And by that, war was almost over. In World War II, they are like, we're not gonna join. It's European thing. Why would we join? Then Pearl Harbor happened. Lots of people already died, and then they joined. So now I think after 2 major wars, their mentality is just like that. Like any threat to the world comes up, we're gonna have to join eventually, otherwise lots of unnecessary death will happen. So that's the basic. I know some people will be like, no, there is some some more political reason behind it. There might be, but basic ideology is this: like we have to join because eventually we'll have to. So remember this whenever people like, why are Americans always there in anybody's war? Why are Americans always there when they don't have to? Because of examples like this. Because if something goes out of hand, eventually they'll have to join, and by then lots of people would have been dead. So it's like that.
So about the same number of US soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe. Germany started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland.
Obviously, I'm pretty sure invasion of Poland, not just soldiers died, lots of civilians died too, lots of Jews. It's just horrible, man. People were sent to concentration camp, starved there. Like, man, people don't even treat their cattle like that. Some cattle that they don't want, some horrible places where they don't even want some animal, even they don't treat like that, like Germans did to the Nazis did to the people of Jews and everybody like that on concentration camps. There are photos where they are ridiculously slim. It's like, god damn, the bones are literally feels like it's gonna pop out of the skin or something. That's just too horrible. How can...
The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions. The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success. And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States.
That's why Germany was more dangerous in World War II than in World War I. Because in World War I, their casualties could be at par to the other people. Even their people died in millions, while others died in millions. When here, look at that. The loss is nothing, and yet they killed every other country's soldiers.
Who were not invaded, but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies.
That's surprising.
Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting.
That's surprising, because UK has been there from the start, I think. US is not, and yet there's lost same amount of people.
In the US and Britain, in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
Oh
But
no.
most Nazi soldiers died in the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering.
Oh no,
The
I know
most
what's
famous
gonna
battle
come.
of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition. 500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East. When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US. And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany. The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war came at a cost.
Damn, look at that. Oh my god, look at the music stop and it's just air sound now. This is ridiculous.
8.7 million is the official tally by the Russian military, a hotly disputed number. Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million.
You got to be kidding me. Look at that. Look at that compared to all that. This is ridiculous. It feels like Russia was against the whole world or something when somebody look at the graph and don't know what's happening. Ah, man. That's the case with past wars, man. Russia is always there. Russia kind of always kicks ass of anybody comes in front of them. But they always have the massive cost. Lots of people, even in the Napoleonic Wars. You know, Russia obviously lots of time, pushed back. Obviously, invasion of Napoleon. Napoleon invaded Russia and they pushed back. But lots of Russians died, man. In World War I, lots of Russians died. In here, it's just ridiculous. Look at that. I mean, if it were by here, I'm like, damn, that's way too much. The Russian lost way too much. All the way here, 8.7 million? That's way too much, man. How many people died in Napoleonic Wars? How many people died in the, this 7 Years' War? How many people died in the Great War? And look at how many just Russians died in this one, 9 million. World War II was horrendous, man. And I'm damn sure if World War III happens, the millions count will be in 3 digits. 100 million, 200 million, 400 millions. Oh, God. If World War III happens, even people recover it, the world will not recover. The mentality, ideology, nothing will recover.
To complete the count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis, Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time. And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe. Six million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust.
6 million? Oh, come on, man. Damn. 6 million civilians like that just killed. Ah.
By country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were
This really puts into perspective, man. Of all countries, people died. Jews, Polish, everybody. How many of them died? Look at that. So lots of them were from camps. Some just basically squads pulling out people from the houses, calling them spies, and just shooting them for no reason. I mean, how can humanity does that? It's just ridiculous. Nazis were really effed up, man. They just like, Jews shouldn't exist. These people shouldn't exist. Just kill them by any means necessary. Oh God.
were killed in the concentration camps. Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution.
God damn.
The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station. Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews. Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
This is a real photo? Oh, come on, man. That's a kid. Ugh. You know what? I don't care what people say, alright? I don't care what people go like, US is meddling everywhere, US is doing this, lots of, European countries are meddling, lots of bad things are happening, and I get it, everything has a validity, maybe they are doing effed up things in the future, but at least a person like Hitler will not rise again in the future, because there will be someone meddling into affairs that make sure nobody rise up. I mean, look at the concentration camps. If some countries like US or something were meddling in, before all this even started, maybe the numbers wouldn't have been this higher. If US has probably joined way early, like from the start, like, no, I'm not having this World War I thing again. Maybe this wouldn't have lasted this long. Maybe this many people wouldn't have died. So maybe meddling sometimes is not that bad. I get it. There is always arguments over anything. Maybe obviously US meddling, European meddling in lots of Middle Eastern countries kill lots of innocent people too. I'm not denying that, but still, as a whole, meddling can be good like this. At least another Hitler won't rise.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called Gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say,
oh God, I remember something. They used to measure people's head. And if they are not at certain measurement that they came up with, they kill them. I mean, how effed up is that?
that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II, which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million.
Come on,
A particularly
man.
dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years.
Alright, I'm gonna be honest, I did not see that one coming. I thought Russian soldiers died the most, but in here, it would have been Holocaust people, obviously, Polish people would have been more dead. But no, Russians like, we are first here too. So what? 8 to 9 million soldiers, 10 million civilians, about 20 million of them died. 20 million, that's a big number. Obviously, women, outnumbers men now. Because how many people died? 20 million is not a small number.
1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation, mostly civilians. Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers. He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag. Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food. The intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion.
Look at the Germany count. Man, that's also effed up, isn't it? Not all Germans were Nazis. Nazis duped their own people. The case about, Volkswagen Beetle. They said, I'm going to give you a car if you put some money to it every monthly payment. Germans didn't know the Nazi thing was, rising up. They thought they were going to get a car. Where all the money went to the tanks and jet planes and things like that. There was no car. So Nazis duped their own people. Their own people were scared after that, like, we can't rise up against Nazi. Because how let's say if there is a party, major amount of party that doesn't like what Nazis doing, what are they going to do? Rise up to Nazis after what they have? So even lots of Germans were captive in their own country. And then they died. Obviously, because other countries are like spiteful now. Lots of their people died, so they killed lots of Germans too. That's just effed up, man. Lots of collateral damage because of some stupid things, that's some stupid ideology of one guy. World War I, you can argue that maybe it's not because just one guy got shot and everybody went to war. That was just an excuse. Everybody wanted to go to war. But in this, it's just one guy's ideology. And everybody had to fight that guy.
But still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million. Let's step back and see where we are with the totals. We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty. China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance. 500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis. But the invasion of China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks. Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations, not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside of Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war, give or take depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history. For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities we have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry. Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years.
Mongols killed 40 millions? That is surprising at that time. Damn.
The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If we want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us this list.
What is An Lushan revolt? That is the
body
highest
count,
number
and
compared
it
to
all
the...
happened in just 6 years. The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died, we can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking. When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase the long peace to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted. European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II. Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq, but rich countries have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire.
Yeah, that's seriously.
To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all, and here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure. It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened. We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs, or report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us.
That is true. You don't know how good you have until you're reminded how effed up it can be. I mean, seriously. People say like, why am I learning about Genghis Khan? Why am I learning about history about 100 years ago? How is that going to be, better for me going forward? I'm gonna be invested in information technology going forward. Why do I care what Genghis Khan did? Why do I care what Napoleon did? Why do I care what happened in World War II? Because you have the mindset of how good you have right now and how bad it can get. History is really important, man.
Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions.
It will continue, let's be honest. It will continue because it will have to. Nuclear weapon basically changed the landscape. Lots of countries, of almost all important countries, have nuclear weapons, which the one that doesn't have it have allies who have nuclear weapons. So it's really hard to see why some major country invading some other countries, because if that country doesn't have nuclear weapons, the close ally of that country basically will have nuclear weapons. So I don't see a massive, direct war happening. Something can happen in backside, somebody not realizing it, or because of some reason they use an excuse, use as to show that we are liberators, we are not trying to invade something, or things like that. People can do things down key, but I highly doubt there's going to be open war like it was before World War II.
Ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
This was a great made video, man. He doesn't have that many video, but he should make, man. This was an awesomely made video. The music, the timing, it was just impeccable. People say that, I'm one of them. The nuclear weapon was a mistake. I'm one of them. Like, I see the end of humanity because of it. But then again, let's be brutally honest. Since World War II, there hasn't been a single massive war because of it. People are scared of nuclear weapons. I don't care how much badass anybody thinks they are, and any dictator or general, like, we can do this, we can kill 50 million and take over those countries, will be afraid now that there's a nuclear warhead that might drop in his head too. So there isn't going to be a major war because of it. And if it happens, it's going to be the last war. We are not cockroaches. We will not survive if a massive war happens. Humanity will cease to exist. So it's basically, the nuclear weapon basically said this: enough of the past war that has been going on for thousands of years. But doesn't matter which war it is, millions of people died needlessly here and there. Enough of it. Whether everybody dies together or don't die at all. That's the mentality now. Obviously, I'm talking about a major scale. People are still dying because of small wars here and there, stupid wars, obviously. Lots of innocents are dying. I'm not oblivious to that. I'm talking about major scale war where the numbers are in extraordinary millions. World War II's deaths were really high, man, compared to the other wars. Damn, World War II was basically the effed up war. The World War I was the Great War. World War II was the effed up war. Seriously. That should be the sub-name of it. World War II, the effed up war. Alright, if you like my reaction, please don't forget to like and subscribe.